Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law Podcast, brought to you by Digital Law and produced by Anson Evaluate. As a bit of background, we at Digital Law are a niche law firm specialising in working solely in the technology and cybersecurity law sector. In each episode, we look at recent stories in the news related to digital technology from around the world, with a specific emphasis on data protection and cybersecurity. For more information on the stories that we're covering this week, please check the links in our show notes. By way of an introduction, I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK, and I'm joined by Peter Wright, and I'll let Peter introduce himself and then we will get started.
Hello everyone, my name is Peter. I'm a solicitor and the Managing Director at Digital Law, and really looking forward to getting our teeth into a couple of very big stories that have happened since our last update for you. You'll have probably seen about, these are both stories that have ended up, in fact, certainly the first couple of stories are big ones that have been in some of the national press, and indeed one of them, our first one, in the international press. So I'll pass over to Amelia to kick us off on them.
Thanks, Peter. So our first story will be looking at the leaked US military group chat. Then we have got the sensitive army papers being found scattered in the streets, 23andMe updates, the NHS software provider fined over 3 million, and then finally a professional headshots with AI story. But before we dive into today's stories, here is some background information on our podcast provider, Anson Evaluate. Anson Evaluate are a consultancy company offering a variety of services, including data protection training, outsourced data protection officer services, and specialising in advising clients over multiple jurisdictions. So kicking off with our first story, and Peter, as you rightly mentioned, this has been all over the press, both within the UK and internationally. And this is the leaked US military group chat. So, journalist Jeffrey Goldberg was added to a Signal platform messaging group, which apparently included Vice President J.D. Vance and Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth, in addition to National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. And the topics being discussed was attacking the Iran-backed Houthi group in Yemen. And there's a lot to even unpack by just that small amount of information.
Yes, and to be honest, we aren't going to look at this from the political side of things. There are numerous other podcasts and sources available to go into the ins and outs of this. The short thing to say from our perspective is we are looking at this from the fact that they were using Signal.
Yeah.
And that they exposed part of the problem inherent in having sensitive discussions like this on a medium that is not really designed for it. And then it's a matter of looking at the implications for that. So, first of all, this has highlighted the fact that, as we saw in the COVID inquiry, an awful lot of decisions and discussions in government now appear to be happening via mobile communication systems. So you had loads of WhatsApps that were key when it came to COVID in terms of discussions. Are we on lockdown? Are we not? And then there was, can certain people provide those WhatsApps? It turns out that they weren't downloaded from the phone or they weren't backed up. Everyone I'm sure is familiar now with, quite often you get to big court cases and lots of evidence on there is on WhatsApp or secure messaging. So I think it was the Colleen Rooney Christie trial
case,
where Rebecca Vardy's phone went ended up in the North Sea or something.
Something to that effect. Yeah.
So an awful lot. So, in that environment, to then see that a crucial discussion around US national security was taking place on Signal probably isn't surprising. Over the decades, we're used to seeing pictures of secretaries of state, national security advisors, sometimes even the president, sat there having a discussion around, are we going to take this action? And then sometimes even watching live links as that came in the situation.
You see it in like a typical movie, don't you? When you're,
yes,
you've got like maybe Olympus has fallen, and they're all sat in this big conference room, and someone says go or fire or something, and then lo and behold, it happens.
We can go all the way back to Dr. Strangelove and Stanley Kubrick showing, this big room, the war room, and there was that immortal lines of "Gentlemen, stop fighting. This is the war room," which kind of sums up the idiocy of these things. Now, the point is that you used to have these discussions in a room, a secure room. The US, they even have this thing called a SCIF. A SCIF is a secure facility whereby, say the president is at a summit and he needs to take a call. He can't just take the call on the mobile. He has to leave the room, walk into another room that is basically a portable room put up by the US administration. He goes into that, and that is the SCIF, and that's where he can have those confidential discussions, take calls, etc. So that's the level of security we're used to having on key national security confidential information. When we then hear about it taking place on Signal, therefore there is a little bit of a suspension of disbelief. Now, what's the difference between Signal and WhatsApp? WhatsApp, you've got all the messages on sender's phone, recipient's phone, and also on a third-party server owned by Meta, parent company of Facebook. Signal differs from that in that it is peer-to-peer. So you have the messages on the sender's phone, messages on the recipient's phone, and nowhere else. So when you then disconnect your phone, you lose all the messages that were on there, which is one of the reasons why I'm currently walking around with two phones, because I don't want to lose all of my Signal messages. It is secure from the perspective of it's encrypted, and that encryption is only going from peer to peer. It's not even going to third-party servers. So from that point of view, from a technical perspective, it's secure. And that will have been the thinking that they then thought, if we want to have ongoing discussion, and part of the defense from the US administration has been, look, this still shows teamwork and people working together at a high level and evaluating and discussing things. It's just taking place on the phone outside of confidential briefings and discussions that might have happened. However, very often, and this is now the pushback that I get from a lot of people when I start saying this is why you shouldn't use WhatsApp, for example, for secure business-related activities. So say you're wanting to discuss something related to law, and you're subject to a duty of confidentiality, and people will say, oh, well, our client wants to talk on WhatsApp, and we let them do that. Or they wanted to SMS message us, or they wanted to use Google Hangouts, or whatever. And the reason we always push back and say no is even if it's encrypted, things like this can happen.
Yeah, particularly as well where this guy was literally just added to the chat by accident.
Yes.
And it's funny enough, the journalist Goldberg, he initially thought it was a hoax.
Yeah.
He initially thought he'd been added to this group chat and it was fake.
Yeah.
And you can understand why, to be honest, because some of the screenshots that I've seen online literally got like emojis in them. And again, you wouldn't think matters of national security
indeed
have got, emojis in them. And fine, maybe questionable on them. But again, you could see why he thought it was a hoax.
Yeah.
But
apparently there was fist pumping taking place after the attack, and you have to think, it doesn't matter who it is, that's military action where people have been killed. Is really emotive, correct, ethical to be going yay. So anyway, let's park that. We are going down that route. Let's bring it back to the security element of it. Is the fact that this guy was added.
Yeah.
A journalist from the Atlantic magazine, the editor of the Atlantic magazine, I think it was added by Mike Waltz, who is the director, the NSA director, National Security Agency director for the US. He seems to have added this. They've said, oh no, it wasn't him personally, it was one of his staffers, but whatever it is, someone's added the wrong person. This is the thing that's easy to happen with WhatsApp, with Signal, particularly where you get larger groups. You cannot be sure exactly who is on there.
Yeah.
And
I think
unless they say, oh, I shouldn't be on here, who's going to go through and check
no, exactly
who's on there? And in this instance, clearly they would. The irony is apparently at one point the Secretary of Defense does say, oh, this is a secure chat, when it isn't, because the journalist is on there. So you can have all the bulletproof encryption in the world, but when you're using an app like this that allows you to add any contact from a phone, this is where you get the problem, which is why I'm always saying to our clients, if you want to have these sorts of things, fine, but you shouldn't be using a freely available app. You want to have something that is secure. So, for example, we have a secure case management system that we use to communicate with our clients. We will not accept SMSs, WhatsApps, signals. It has to be on that format. And, you can still have it as an app on your phone. Our clients can have an app on your phone. You can still have that level of interaction, so you can, if you're traveling a lot or whatever, you can do that. It doesn't have to be, open up the laptop and look around. You've still got that level of ease of access. It's just that you aren't at risk of things like this happening where the wrong person was in there. In this, it's just the bad luck of, seemingly the bad luck of, I mean, if they'd say copied in a parent from the school run inadvertently, that's a mistake. It's where it's a mistake, and not only was it, you kind of copied in the worst possible person, and it wasn't even just a journalist, it was a journalist who is, not a friend of the administration. Let's just leave it there. But they kind of copied in one of the worst people they could have copied in, who then had the ability to not just write the story, but put it in there and make sure that it will get wide receivership, which it has.
I think one point we've not mentioned yet is the human error element, because obviously you mentioned that it's not necessarily going to have been Michael Waltz that added this chap to the group, that it might have been one of the staff members. This is where that lovely thing that we like to talk about very often, training, comes in very handy. Because, well, obviously you've got the human error standpoint that unfortunately we are in fact all human and things can happen. But it's just training against the risks, because if you know that you've got a big group chat, it's flagging that you've got a big group chat and be really careful who you add to it. Don't fat finger it and add the wrong person, because it's very easily done. But if you're just making sure that you're checking when you're doing this. Because a similar thing applies to email. Sometimes, autocorrect will autocorrect an email into it. Sometimes handy, sometimes means you end up copying the wrong Stuart or the wrong Dave or the wrong Mike into the email, because there are many Stuarts, Daves and Mikes involved.
And you can end up with that auto entry, like as you say, on sort of emails, or even on, and of course that's what happened in this instance, is if you were adding this in on a device that had autofill on there, and they started to type a name and up came the contact info, and they've gone, yes, I'll have that one, and pressed the button. Or it could be that you would put in the first 2 or 3 letters on the field, and it's the phone that suggests, is this the full name you meant? You then select that, and that could have meant that even the wrong name was put in. So it was someone typing Jeffrey, and it went to fill in Jeffrey, and it gave the wrong surname, and it put it in there, and then the wrong person searched and added. This is how that happens, and sometimes it's through mobile devices trying to make life easier, when if anything, they've made life 10 times worse than it should have been. We need to talk, though, just about the implications now, don't we?
Yeah, exactly.
So, and we were talking about this earlier, actually, before we started recording, because, well, it's the implications of the seriousness of the discussion on here. So, the journalist has printed bits of this conversation. He hasn't printed all of it. And indeed, he has redacted some bits as well. And the US administration said, we didn't share anything that was, particularly sensitive. But there is the possibility that could have happened. What do I mean by that? When you've got discussions at this high level, it would have been quite foreseeable that someone would have said, we know that we want to attack and send our attack here at this time, at this date, because we've got intelligence that says these certain people will be there. And it turns out that they were wanting to take out a senior group of leadership of the Houthi rebels. How did they know those people were going to be there at that time? Probably human intelligence. What if the source that they have, the confidential informant that they've got within the Houthi rebels, was mentioned in this chat? And then that's being leaked outside of the circle that it should have been in. Well, first of all, that would be an offence under US law. But it kind of illustrates then that that's where things get problematic from the sharing of data. And we've talked an awful lot on our podcast in the past about things like the Five Eyes mechanism that allows other countries to share their intelligence with the United States. Now, there have been occasions in the past when this has proved problematic. Recently, a former source of the British government, a chap called Oleg Gordievsky, who was a defector from the Soviet Union in the 1980s. He died recently, but just reading his obituary was fascinating, because it turned out that the reason they had to get him out from the Soviet Union in the late 80s was intelligence was shared by the British government with the US government, and that went in front of someone at the CIA who was a Soviet spy. So, of course, that compromises the identity of the agent, and they had to get him out, and they had to do it sort of very quickly, and then literally he was sort of spirited out in the boot of a car before the Soviets could do anything about it. And the reason I mention this is that even at a time there, before widespread digital communications, you have issues around the sharing of really secret, confidential, ultra-secure information like that, that it could still get in front of the wrong pair of eyes.
Yeah.
And that is at a time, in effect, of war, when you have the Cold War going on, the two big blocs, the Soviet Union and the West, and what was happening there. So if that could happen then, this has just showed what could happen now when countries share their information with the United States. Could it mean that that information is then being shared in a group chat like this, which could prove leaky if they're not checking who's on those groups and what communications methods they're using?
Definitely doesn't fill you with any sort of confidence, and probably doesn't also fill the government or any other agencies who are sharing this data with confidence either.
Well, hopefully now they'll work out that if you are going to use Signal, there's certain checks you're going to have to do to make sure this doesn't happen again. But ideally, you think surely they're going to be using other more secure means to have these discussions in future. But the point is that when it comes to that secure sharing of information, things like this, leaks like this, are what puts people's lives in danger. This puts the lives of intelligence operatives in danger. It puts the lives of their handlers in danger when potentially at the top levels it isn't being properly managed and kept hold of securely. And it's little things like this you might think, oh, this is a storm in a teacup, and already the US is saying, oh, this will all be forgotten within a month. Well, this is the stuff, unfortunately, within intelligence circles, they will remember, and governments might start getting a little bit more reticent about, are we going to share this crucial bit of information with the US if we think it will put our intelligence operatives, our intelligence assets at risk?
And that leads us very nicely onto our next story, where we're looking at sensitive army papers found scattered in the streets.
Yes.
So piles of papers containing sensitive military information have been found scattered along a city's streets. They included soldiers' ranks, emails, shift patterns, and weapons issue detail, and information which appears to relate to accessing weapons storage and intruder detection systems. The documents were discovered spilling out of a black bin bag in the Scotswood area of Newcastle by a football fan earlier in March. And according to information security consultants, they pose a significant threat to the individuals named in them. The Ministry of Defence said it was looking into the matter urgently and was conducting an internal investigation.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just awful. I mean, it's similar to the last story in the fact that we've got this information being leaked, but this is physical copies that are being found in the streets.
So just in case anyone thought that we were being particularly harsh about the US administration, here we now have Britain arguably doing something even worse. These records included shift patterns, when people are going to be at work, when they're not going to be at work. Included details of security systems.
People's ID numbers.
Yeah, it had documents that were headed official, top secret and sensitive. Clearly this is stuff that was intended to go into confidential waste, and I mean,
well, one would think.
Yeah, anyone who regularly walks past a law firm will know that they'll have to have shredders come very often, once a week, and stuff is industrially shredded on site. If you haven't got that stuff, there are companies that come and do it for you. So there's one law firm in a building next to where I live, and regularly I would walk past on the way to, say, the train station, and they would have the shredders come in on a Thursday morning, and there's confidential waste being shredded on site. Now, if you're doing that within a law firm where you've got duties of confidentiality, why isn't that happening at the Ministry of Defence, where you have an even more pressing duty of confidentiality?
Oh,
but instead, clearly it was going into a black bin bag, which shouldn't have been the case. This should have been even if it was old stuff, it should have been securely destroyed.
Well, apparently one of the footnotes that said official sensitive, according to government guidance, can in some cases mean that the information could lead to a threat to life if compromised. So while obviously a law firm has significant duties of confidentiality, we're talking about life and death in these instances. Therefore, you'd think that your ability to safely destroy documents where necessary would happen. But,
particularly where we were just talking about the risk, to intelligence operatives. Here we're talking about the risk to military personnel. You might go, well, what's it matter if you've got details of someone's shift? You then know when someone is on duty, when they're off duty, when they're having the shift changeover. And the British military have been a target for many decades. It's not that long ago that we had the troubles in Northern Ireland. Still, in Northern Ireland, you will get the occasional attack on British military personnel who are stationed there, and security personnel. And that applies to the rest of the country. These sorts of things, it wasn't, certainly back in the 70s, 80s and 90s, it wasn't limited to just happening in Northern Ireland. It would happen in other parts of the country. There always has remained an ongoing security threat in that regard. So, I'm saying here just from the general point of terrorism, as opposed to any sort of Irish separatism point. The point is that having the movements and internal operations of military personnel leaked in this way is inherently dangerous to their security. And the fact that it was just found freely blowing in the wind along a street in Newcastle, again, doesn't fill you with confidence that the right standards are being consistently applied.
No, exactly. And that again leads us on to our next breach story. It seems that we've got a full podcast of breaches, unfortunately, today. We're next looking at 23andMe. So if you're a regular listener to the podcast, you'll have probably heard us speak many a time about 23andMe. But essentially, 23andMe is a genetic information company. And they had a massive, massive data breach.
They did. So there's been a formal intent to fine them £4.59 million following a preliminary enforcement notice, following a very significant data protection breach that took place. Now, 23andMe are one of these organizations where you can have a simple sort of pinprick blood test carried out, and then they'll do your DNA sequencing for you so you can work out where you're from. So by definition, we're talking about fairly sensitive information related to health, ethnicity, etc. The information that they would provide and that they would then continue to store could be quite sensitive. One common story that came out from 23andMe is that you'd sometimes find that people would carry out this test and then, for example, find out that they were related when they didn't know they were related.
And that's going to cause some problems.
Yeah. So sometimes there was things like that. Usually it would give you your background in terms of if you found out that, for example, you might have always thought your heritage was partially from a certain background. So, would there be a story about an element of ethnicity that's sometimes been passed down? I mean, I was always told I was innate Scottish. I don't know if I am or not, but it might be in there somewhere. And if I took a 23andMe test, it would tell me if that was true or not. The point is that it was very often a sort of novelty gift, and that's the reason why apparently you can only sell novelty gifts so far. And it's turned out that this isn't a sustainable business plan. It's now gone into Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the States. They hold records of millions of people who were their customers, and of course they hold all of those results. So a lot of advice recently had been circulating in the States saying if they have that DNA information, to now get it securely destroyed, to request that 23andMe destroy that, because there is a little bit of concern about what could happen if that information fell into the wrong hands. But in this instance, we're already looking at the fact that there was a serious breach and the ICO was investigated as a result. So therefore, their systems weren't great, and now those systems are going to be disposed of under the whole thing going into bankruptcy and administration.
Well, that's a delightful, outcome there, isn't it? Keep it light.
I was going to say we always aim to keep it light. So there we go.
And then the next story is not that much better. So NHS software provider has been fined $3 million over data breach. I mean, crikey, we're not doing well here, are we? An NHS provider has been fined $3 million by the ICO over security failings that led to a ransomware attack on the NHS. So the Advanced Computer Software Group was fined for a breach that put personal information of 79,404 people at risk. The UK's data protection watchdog has said the firm provides IT and software services to organisations around the country, including the NHS and other health providers, and was handling information in its role as a data processor. So the breach that we're talking about actually dates back to 2022, when hackers gained access to patients' phone numbers and medical records, as well as details on how to gain entry into the homes of 890 people receiving care at home. So the hackers were unidentified, but they were able to gain access to the information by using customers' accounts that did not have sufficient protection in the form of multi-factor authentication. And the regulator's investigation concluded that Advanced did not have the appropriate security measures in place prior to the incident. So as a result, the cyber attack led to the disruption of critical services, including NHS 111, and left some healthcare staff unable to access patient records. So all in all, 3 million, I don't think that's even quite enough given the absolute state of what it left the NHS in.
Yes, but to be honest, the ICO, I think they haven't really been issuing much in the way of fines up until this year, and now we're actually getting a spate of these larger monetary penalty notices. They seem to have always done a lot of things like privacy and electronic communications regs enforcement, for like bulk texting and emails and things, which are usually much smaller fines. And actually, this is a positive thing. I think to be turning around and issuing large-scale enforcement like this is a good thing, because it then hopefully brings those sectors, those industries into line by looking and thinking, oh, right, so we know that that isn't acceptable and we'll have to make sure it doesn't happen again. I mean, you mentioned 890 people receiving care at home whose security and secure entry details were leaked. But more broadly, this was a leak affecting 79,404 people. So we're talking about a really large bulk scale, and the nature of that information being somewhat sensitive. And the lack of things like multi-factor authentication at this point.
Which is a comparatively easy thing to implement.
Kind of is.
And most, software actually encourages you to use that now.
Yeah.
And in fact, sometimes it's not even just, two-factor. Sometimes it goes as far as like 3 or 4 different factors.
And I think, certainly official government advice now, certainly from the National Cyber Security Centre, I think, is you should be having multi-factor authentication. So then when you get, this is not the NHS, but it is a large supplier of software to the NHS. For them not to be having these sorts of levels of security is disappointing, shall we say. It's interesting that the ICO was going to fine them 6 million on a provisional basis. It's now been reduced to 3 million. So they've clearly had to provide a lot of mitigation to go, well, this is why it happened. We're very sorry that it happened and it won't happen again. But it's simply the fact that this has put more strain on a healthcare system that was already under pressure. So the fact that we're getting good large-scale enforcement like the 23andMe one as well, I think is a positive.
No, absolutely.
Trying to be positive.
Yes. Well, we have actually got a different story that is a little bit more positive for the end of the podcast. And this is how to AI. So this is how to use ChatGPT to get a professional headshot. And so allegedly, if you upload 3 simple photos of yourself and make sure that it has 3 different angles or more, you can copy and paste a prompt such as generate a corporate headshot of this person, and you can get what looks to be a very professional headshot. And while we could absolutely sit here and go through why you perhaps should not do that because you don't know where your personal data is going, it is actually maybe a useful tool for potentially some of our listeners to use.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is just showing that AI can have a positive impact. I know that we normally give AI a kicking and tech a kicking on this podcast, but we're not overall super positive. But this is certainly an upshot of newer technology and ways it can be used to benefit others without necessarily having an impact on someone else or a breach or misinformation. This is nice and simple, I say,
exactly
to use.
I think it does have its benefits. I mean, look, if you have the idea of the professional headshot, and literally the article that we're looking at on LinkedIn, which is actually a post from How to AI, the professional shot that is rendered literally looks studio quality.
Oh, it's cracking.
So it's the whole suit and tie. It's the that sort of generic greyish background that you used to get for your school photo, and it does the job. Now, if you were to, and I remember the days when you used to have to go and get these things done. If you did go and have them done professionally, you would have to go and pay a photographer to do it. So it would be, that would cost you money of an indeterminate amount. This way, you're getting it off ChatGPT for free, and it's the sheer usefulness of it. You can have 3 photos, not necessarily from immediately right now. It could be from another time that are taken. You haven't put together. It's perfectly rendered. It's ideal for that, giving off the professional image that you can then use on your LinkedIn profile or whatever other networking site or business need that you have for them. And it could be that you wanted, for example, to have, say you're working on your a website for your company. It could be that this is how you generate professional looking headshots for all of the staff without having to have a photographer come in to take all of those things and schedule that and the pain of doing it. And imagine, I mean, we're a fairly small organisation compared to some, but even then, getting the days when we have everyone in the office at one time to do something like that are few and far between. So actually just being able to do that by saying, right, just take these 3 photos, put it through ChatGPT, and we'll then be able to have uniform pictures, would be a massive saving. So yeah, this is absolutely an idea of the positivity of AI. But I do have to add one thing.
I sense the but coming.
Just bear in mind that you're putting, of course, your personal photo up there and sharing that with ChatGPT.
Then again, I will combat that by saying if you post on Facebook, Instagram, any of that stuff, it's probably already there, kicking around somewhere anyway. So, yeah. What's the harm? Just another photo.
Yeah. Who do you trust more, Sam Altman or Mark Zuckerberg?
Pick your poison. So that was our last discussion of the episode. And if you have any questions about what we have talked about today, please feel free to email us at admin@digitallawuk.com. A summary of today's stories is also available on our website, as well as the links to the original stories containing more information. And if you'd like to hear more from us, including information about our subscriber-only podcasts, webinars, and events, then please subscribe to Premium via our Patreon channel using the link in the show notes. And speaking of webinars, I'll hand over to Peter for more information on these.
So we're doing a series of webinars with MBL, who are a professional training provider. If you take a look on our social media channels, you will see that we are regularly sharing links to the almost 10 different MBL events that we're doing during the course of this year. The first one that we're doing is on data subject access requests in bulk. So we sort of take the basics of what a subject access request requires if you're turning around these sorts of requests, and then we sort of look at the process that you would need to have in place and how that can be engineered if you're having these requests coming in on a regular basis. So almost sort of the project management behind handling a DSAR, at the same time looking at the mechanisms of what information should be disclosed and what shouldn't be, and applying exemptions and all these fun things. So we'll be sharing, take a look on social media for those links. You can register for those courses. They are being delivered as Learn Live events, so it will actually be a live event that you would be able to join and ask questions, and then afterwards you'd have access to the recording as well.
Thanks, Peter. Finally, a big thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping to produce this podcast. And if you'd like to hear more about Anson Evaluate services, please take a look at their website. You can find it at www.ansonevaluate.com. And just a reminder, these episodes are available on our website, YouTube channel, and podcast channels as well, such as Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, essentially anywhere you can find your podcasts. Please feel free to leave us a review as well. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again next week.